Scott Sagan. I'm a professor of political science and the co-director of the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. I write on many issues dealing with nuclear weapons. I'm happy to discuss that research and career issues with you. I've written a number of books, the first being a book called Moving Targets, which was about the evolution of U.S. nuclear weapons doctrine. What have we aimed at? What deterrence strategies has the United States had, and how have they changed over time? A second book was called The Limits of Safety, Organizations, Accidents, and Nuclear Weapons, which was an effort to try to test two different theories about organizational reliability, high reliability theory and normal accidents theory, through the medium of understanding false warning incidents and near accidents with nuclear weapons. And I concluded that we've had many more accidents and near accidents than people had previously recognized. A third book was called The Spread of Nuclear Weapons, a Debate. And here I joined with a senior political scientist by the name of Kenneth Waltz, who argued that the spread of nuclear weapons was a good thing because it would lead more states to have stable deterrent relations, just as he believes that Russia and the United States had a stable nuclear deterrent relation during the Cold War. And I argued the opposite, that nuclear weapons had dangerous effects for everyone, but especially dangerous effects for new countries acquiring nuclear weapons, especially those that are controlled by their military or ones that are controlled by a authoritarian personalist dictator. So that became a book that was debated in three different editions and has been widely used. In the last 10 years or so, I've moved into two new areas. One is the understanding of public opinion regarding nuclear weapons, using survey experiments to understand whether the American public, the British, the Israeli, and the French public believes that there's a taboo against using nuclear weapons, or whether they would be willing to use nuclear weapons under different scenarios. And secondly, about the law of armed conflict. Does the law of armed conflict restrict the military doctrines that nuclear states adopt? And what does it actually say about the use of nuclear weapons? So it's both a legal analysis about what the laws of armed conflict say if they're applied to nuclear weapons. And then secondly, it's an empirical study that actually, how does that actually influence state behavior? So that's what I've been working on for a long time. I was a junior at the University of Aberdeen in Northeast Scotland. I went to Oberlin College for my undergraduate, but as often is the case in small liberal arts colleges, you spend a year abroad. And I went to Scotland and was a research assistant for a Welsh professor by the name of Phil Williams, who was teaching in Scotland at the time, and had asked me to be a research assistant on a project about the Mansfield Amendment, the efforts in Congress to pull U.S. troops out of NATO unless NATO states gave more for their defense, an issue that is obviously still with us today. I knew that being a research assistant for a professor was a big deal, and gave me an opportunity to impress someone and to shine and do my best work. And I spent a lot of time writing what I thought he should say about the Mansfield Amendment, because he was had been asked to write it for a journal. And when I turned it into him, he called me into his office and said, "I can't use the paper that you've written for my article." And I said, "Why?" I was heartbroken, because this was the biggest project I'd ever done, and I'd done my best work on it. And he said that I can't use it because I read it and there was nothing I wanted to add it. So I sent it to them and they're publishing it under your name. That was a very generous thing for Phil Williams to do to a 20-year-old research assistant. And I've always appreciated that. And I've always tried to model myself, that is, trying to give opportunities to young people and to pay back. The second big experience that I had was later in life that changed my life as well. that was what made me convinced I wanted to get a PhD and go into security studies. The kind of work I do was influenced by a job that I had after I finished my PhD. I went from the ivory tower of Harvard to a windowless room in the basement of the Pentagon and worked on nuclear issues for the Organization of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. These are operational military questions. What happens when you put nuclear forces on alert? How long can you stay on alert? What are the influences of low level missile defenses on strategic stability? We were doing lots of studies for the US military as a civilian working inside the military organization. And that got me very interested in nitty gritty issues of strategy, not just abstract deterrence theory, but rather how is this operationalized? How does the organization that manages these weapons try to do this in a safe manner? What are their views about what deters and what doesn't deter? So I became a political scientist, but one that has a strong interest in organizations, in bureaucracies, and in operations. Certainly when I was at Harvard, I had two PhD thesis advisors, Sam Huntington and Stanley Hoffman. Um, they were very different, one being much more conservative, Huntington, one being much more liberal, Hoffman. I found myself as a political moderate sort of being between them, and that was okay. I liked having their different perspectives on these things. They were both different as social scientists in that Hoffman was much more of a qualitative, historically driven social scientist. Huntington was more of a quantitative, although I would say also had very much empirical data from historical case studies in mind, and that also influenced me a lot. So I would think that those two individuals, in part because I didn't agree with either of them 100%, helped me forge my own path. And I very much appreciated that neither of them felt that they had to mold me. I think too often students end up having such a forceful experience with a mentor that they develop less of their own ideas or fewer of their own ideas. And by having two mentors who disagree with each other, that forced me to develop my own. Well, I'm a big believer in what's called active learning, that is using simulations of different sorts to get students to be out of their comfort zone in terms of the things that they think that they know already and get them into new areas where they haven't thought through all the complications, and force them to do that by role playing in essence. So for example, in a large lecture class, International Security in a Changing World, every year we run a simulation of a non-proliferation treaty review conference in which every country or every student is given the identity of a delegation that they're participating in. The Russian delegation to the NPT, which will include the ambassador to the NPT, a member of the Ministry of Defense, a member of the Ministry of Energy, a member of the intelligence services. They then craft what they believe is the Russian appropriate strategy for this conference and what the goals should be. And then they meet with Vladimir Putin, who is a PhD student, or in this case, an ex-US ambassador, who then reviews their strategy and approves or disapproves or gives them alternative goals that they're supposed to achieve. And then they go out and negotiate with the other delegations from the US, France, the UK, Poland, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, Japan, all the states that are at the NPT review conference. And what I find is that by forcing students to get out of their box, by giving them the national identity of another country, not their own, they helps them think through, well, what are that country's interests? Not what we often have a tendency to do is to think, well, if other people just understood, they think that what I consider my interests are in theirs too. And I just need to tell them that loudly and often, and that's a horrible trait that we have too often. By putting them in that other person's shoes, they actually have to research what did this country do at the last NPT review conference? What has changed? What are our state's interests as opposed to what's in what I think is the national interest of or the global interest? So I teach often in other classes, I do the same kind of thing. We do a simulation of making a decision about whether the United States should use special forces or a bombing raid against a suspected ISIS leadership meeting to plan a terrorist attack. And they have to go into the scenario and have to think through what are acceptable and unacceptable levels of collateral damage, et cetera. So I'm a strong believer, whether you're talking about teaching them about the rules of war or about international strategy, in getting students to think not just theoretically, but also to think about how policies are made and shaped and think through the complexities. Well, I like to tell students in the general public that you may not be interested in nuclear weapons, but nuclear weapons are interested in you. Because if they're used, there's a strong possibility that they will be used in ways that strongly influence your future, either your future life, depending on if conflict escalates, or the environment, even if it doesn't impact you directly, it will impact other parts of the world in ways that would be very important to you. And if they are used in a limited way, it seems to me that the impact on global politics will depend on whether they're used in a limited way that brings success to the state that uses them or failure. If there's a failure, for example, if Russia uses tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine and it leads them to win the war, I think that would have a horrible effect on the spread of nuclear weapons because many other countries then would try to acquire nuclear weapons. If Russia uses nuclear weapons and it leads the US and NATO to use conventional forces and defeat Russia in Ukraine and the war ends with a defeat, then I think actually the spread of nuclear weapons would not be encouraged by the Russian nuclear use because other countries would say, well, that didn't even help Russia. So to me, these issues are really important. They are increasingly important because of the war in Ukraine, because of the possibility of Iran getting nuclear weapons in the near future and the consequences that will have. And the public should be paying more attention to these things. They tend not to because they've got other problems that they worry about. But these are really crucial issues for the future of not just the countries directly involved, but countries indirectly involved, because this could easily become a global, not a local war. I see many misconceptions. I think the public first underestimates the effects of nuclear weapons. Second, I think that the public grossly exaggerates the number of weapons in each country's arsenals. So they underestimate the effect physically, but they overestimate the overall numbers. And I think that most members of the public incorrectly think that the US and NATO has a no first use policy, that we would not use nuclear weapons first. But of course, we've never had that policy. Whether we should or not is a different matter. And people will just debate that in great detail. But factually, we have never had a no first use policy. And we maintain that we might use nuclear weapons under a variety of circumstances, not just in response to another country using nuclear weapons, but to a conventional attack that puts at risk vital interests of the United States, and even in response to a chemical, biological, or even cyber attack that creates effects similar to the effects of a nuclear strike. We hold open the right to respond with nuclear weapons against such non-nuclear attacks. And the public has no idea of that. First, I've already alluded to, which I think in September 2022, the world came to the closest of a nuclear conflict than we had since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Uh, Vladimir Putin threatened to use nuclear weapons from the very opening, indeed, even before the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. But most people, including most intelligence estimates, according to newspaper reports out of Washington, did not think the likelihood of Russia using nuclear weapons was high. That all changed in September 2022. And the reason for that was threefold. One was that Putin, after annexing portions of Ukraine, shifted and said that now this is part of Russia. Our policy is that we hold open the right to use nuclear weapons if our sovereignty is threatened. That applies now to the new areas of former Ukrainian territory, which were under dispute and were actually having live conflict in when he annexed them. Second, according to newspaper reports, the U.S. intelligence agency picked up chatter, that is, picked up discussions within the Russian military that was contemplating or planning or thinking through nuclear use scenarios. And third, what Putin actually said was that there was a precedent set for using nuclear weapons to end a war, and that was Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I don't know what the United States government officials said to their Russian counterparts. We do know that Secretary Austin, Secretary Blinken, and head of the CIA, Bill Burns, all spoke with their counterparts in Russia. And it has been reported, at least, that the threat that was made was that the US and perhaps other NATO nations would get directly involved in the fighting with conventional weapons only, but would do enormous damage to Russian military forces in Ukraine, in the Black Sea, and possibly inside Russia itself. Now, again, we don't know the full details of that, but I think that is a very dangerous situation that we're in. I think the United States, if my reporting is right on this, did the right thing, in my judgment, by threatening to escalate by getting more involved, but de-escalating by saying we'd only use conventional weapons. And I'd lastly just note that that is a scenario that could play out again in the future, because if Ukraine pushes Russia back and Putin faces a defeat, he'll be in the situation he was in September and October 2022, feeling that perhaps he wants to threaten the use of nuclear weapons to try to get out of any kind of scenario in which he's losing. So I think this crisis is not over, and it's a very serious one, and one that it would be valuable for the public in the UK as well in the United States to be paying more attention. Area that I've thought through the most is about the importance of keeping a man in the loop on decision making in this area and not having automated decisions. There is certainly a degree of I would say automatic decision making in the warning systems. That is, different interpretations that come through are done in a way that makes it not very easy to challenge and not know all the details about what goes in. So in that sense, part of the system is already automated just in terms of providing intelligence information and warning information. Hopefully that is done with multiple sources and multiple, what's called dual phenomenology, different kinds of information coming together. So that's important. But I also think that the ultimate decision-making has to be made by humans. And that's very important to keep that there. And I'll give you just one example that I think about, which was what happened in 1979 when the operators at NORAD, the North American Defense Command, got information that there's a large-scale, in that case, Soviet missile attack occurring and had just been launched against the United States. And the officer in charge looked at this and said, wow, this is really frightening. It seems to be accurate. And then noticed that the attack was identical to the attack that had been planned, that had been simulated in their training modules. And he came up with a counterintuitive argument that I think is very much a human phenomenon. It would be hard for machine learning to do this because it's trained on those scenarios. And he said, boy, in the real world, things never work out exactly like what we had anticipated. And the fact that this is identical to what we had anticipated makes me skeptical that it's real. I thought that was brilliant in a way. And it's a sign to me of why it's important to have human beings with all their frailty, nonetheless have some insights that AI wouldn't have. And that's a good example of that.